Good evening, and welcome to the Maltz Museum of Jewish Heritage in Beechwood, Ohio. Tonight we present High Crimes and High Drama, a conversation featuring Nuremberg prosecutor Henry King and enemy of the state author Michael Scharf. King and Scharf are professors at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. Dan Moulthrop, commentator and producer for WCPN, Cleveland's national public radio station, will moderate the discussion. The program begins with remarks from Professor King.
This subject, and its comparison to Nuremberg. For me, Nuremberg equates with accountability on the highest level. And Michael Scharf and Michael Newton have performed a public service by publishing their book on Saddam Hussein, which implicitly keeps the spirit of Nuremberg alive today. There are, of course, differences, but there are also striking similarities. Nuremberg said that sovereigns are not immune from prosecution for their criminal deeds. The trial of Saddam Hussein illustrates that this principle is alive and well today. Nuremberg was an international trial, but the Iraqis wanted to hold these trials on their own turf, with their own judges. They took steps to see that their defendants, including Saddam Hussein, were well represented at the trial. And there's considerable evidence that the trial was fair. The trial was public and reported in the press, and it was vital that the Iraqi public know of Saddam Hussein's misdeeds and why he was being charged. The trial is also important for reference purposes, so that other dictators of Saddam Hussein's ilk know that there will be consequences for the misdeeds. In some cases, the example may dissuade others from prospective criminal action. In other cases, where illegal activities continue, those carrying them out can no longer plead innocence as a defense. Nuremberg marked the reach of international law to impact on individuals, whereas early it had been confined to impact on states and state-to-state relationships. The case of Saddam Hussein illustrates that no matter how powerful a natural leader has been, there will be consequences if he violates this precept of international law as set forth in Nuremberg. I congratulate Michael Scharf and his colleague Michael Newton for making the record of Saddam Hussein available to us in narrative form. I believe it is must reading for all of us. So without further ado, I present Michael Scharf, who is my distinguished colleague at Case Western Reserve Law School. I first met Michael when he was attorney advisor to the State Department in Septor Johnson at that time. I've also followed his career and admired the force with which he attacked these problems. He's everywhere. Just a few days ago, he was at Cambridge University delivering a lecture. And not much earlier than that, in Cambodia, helping the Cambodian prosecution convict the Khmer Rouge. So his life is one of total dedication, very important. And for that, he was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by 6 developing countries this past year. He deserves every recognition we can give him. We're lucky to have Michael Scharf in Cleveland, so it's a great honor to present Michael here today. Michael.
Let me introduce the other VIP we have with us. We're very fortunate to have moderating this program today Daniel Mothra, who is someone who you probably hear every morning on WCPN. He's got the best radio talk show in Cleveland, and I think one of the best in the whole country. And thank you for coming out today and doing this.
It's a pleasure. I don't know what I'm doing up here on the stage with you guys. It's a real honor. And Professor King, I'm glad that you're up here as well to provide the broader context for Michael's work. which is hugely important, but obviously he could never have done any of it if you hadn't gone first. So I think we should really, we really want to honor you as well.
Well, I'll grab this seat up here because I don't see any seats available.
Well, you know, a lot of my thinking about this evening, and let me welcome all of you too. I don't know if we've officially done that. Thank you all for coming here tonight. It's a really cold, rainy night, and I think a lot of us have all sorts of other things on our minds, that, you know, including, as Michael and I were talking before, Rod Blagojevich and all sorts of craziness that's going on in the world, but it'll be nice to sort of leave that aside for the next hour and a half. We're going to talk up here for a little bit. We want to make room for your questions as well, so and we'll do that in, you know, about 30, 40 minutes or something like that, I imagine. But Michael, I wanted to ask you to start off by setting the stage for us. When Saddam Hussein was captured and crawled out of that spider hole, and I imagine that picture's up here somewhere, it's probably flashed up here once or twice. There was suddenly a need for a court, for a high tribunal that didn't yet exist. What was going on?
All right, so 2003, the United States decides to invade Iraq. By the way, I had publicly said that I didn't think the invasion was legally justified, but in retrospect, I think Iraq is better off without Saddam in charge, because for 30 years he had really terrorized his population. The United States goes in there, and for a while they're looking around trying to find the former leaders who are on a deck of cards, and they're like rabbits who have hidden and scattered throughout the country. And one by one, each was apprehended, and finally, in December 2003, Saddam is taken out of that rabbit hole. And I think in those moments when they grabbed him out of the rabbit hole, and we've actually, in the book, we've interviewed all of the soldiers who were there, and that chapter gives you for the first time the flavor of what it felt like to be just a line soldier with the job of trying to find Saddam Hussein. And in that one moment when they pulled him out, I think they were this close to killing him instead of retrieving him. And I think there were a lot of people both in Iraq and the United States who kind of wish that that's how it had gone, because the trial was very messy and in some people's eyes quite a disaster. It would have saved a lot of trouble to have dealt with him that way. But I think it was the same situation that your colleagues at Nuremberg faced 60 years ago. Henry tells me the story about how Winston Churchill said, you know, we shouldn't have a trial. We should just have a firing squad. And Joseph Stalin says, that's a capital idea, Winston. I've got a list of 50,000.
I've used it before.
Yeah, he says, I have a list of 50,000 names, and we'll just line them up. And Roosevelt was actually going to go along with it. It wasn't until Roosevelt died in April of '45 and Truman came to power that Truman, who was very much persuaded by Henry Stimson, his Secretary of War, said, look, you know, the world will be better off if we have a trial for this man and for these Nazis. And what they were trying to do, I think, is establish a historic record. They thought that it would help discredit the leaders and bring Germany into the civilized nations, and maybe it would be a deterrent. So in the future, despots wouldn't do that kind of thing. Unfortunately, after Nuremberg, the Cold War descended, and there wasn't another Nuremberg until the Yugoslavia Tribunal was created. And by the time Saddam was pulled out of the rabbit hole, we were in a whole new world, a world of accountability, where you had the Yugoslavia Tribunal, the Rwanda Tribunal, the Sierra Leone Tribunal, the Cambodia Tribunal was being formed, and they made the right decision. They said, let's have a trial. Now, the tricky part here was that the Iraqis wanted to try him in Iraq with Iraqi judges, and they absolutely did not want to send him to The Hague or some international trial. And the United States was not big into nation building. That was not something that the Bush administration...
Despite all of that rhetoric?
Right. Well, in fact, I think Bush during his election said, I don't believe that that's what armies are for, you know, not building nations, they're fighting wars. And he really believed that. So they were not equipped to build up Iraq, and a lot of mistakes were made. But I think they felt very strongly that, you know, they should turn the country back over to Iraq, and that they needed to start that process by having Saddam tried by the Iraqis. And so about that point, I get this call from Baghdad. A guy by the name of Greg Kehoe from the Regime Crimes Liaison Office calls me up. And this guy, Greg, who you know, has this baritone voice. He sounds a little bit like Darth Vader. And he says, Michael, and I'm like, wow. He says, this is Greg Kehoe from Baghdad calling. And I'm from the RCLO. And having worked in the State Department, I knew that if someone calls you with initials, you know, it could be something very bad or something very exciting. But he asked me if I would come and help train the judges and write the rules of procedure and then give advice to the judges for the trial of Saddam Hussein. And I said, Greg, you know, not only was I against the invasion to begin with, but I have made it my life's advocacy, as Henry has, to think that an international criminal tribunal is the best way of dealing with fallen leaders. And I really thought that Saddam Hussein ought to be sent to The Hague or some international tribunal. And he said, well, that's not going to happen. He's going to be tried in Baghdad. This is where the trial is going to be. And so, Professor, you can sit on the sidelines and hurl criticisms at us, or you can get in here, get your hands dirty, and try to make a difference. And you could try to make this a more fair and effective process. And that was really a tough choice for me. I really agonized over that. Because I didn't want my reputation and my career to be used to try to add legitimacy to something that the NGO community and many of my colleagues were really writing off as a snake-bitten process from the beginning. But at the same time, you know, this was going to be one of the trials of the century. And I had been talking to Henry for so many years, knowing how exciting it was for him to get in the trenches and have that kind of experience, and I wanted that too. So I said, all right, on one condition. If I think everything's a disaster, I want to be able to say it on TV, on the radio, in a book. And I want that in writing. Because I knew from my State Department days that when you work in the government, you have to get everything cleared. And they often will edit out anything negative about the government. I wanted to tell the unvarnished story. And that's in fact what emerges in this book. This is not a story that says that this tribunal was a wonderful thing, that it was a huge success story. Nor is it a story that says that it was a complete and utter disaster. It's a story really of heroes, of people who tried heroically to make something work under challenges that were extraordinary. And it didn't work so well. And the story of why it didn't work is in there, and the human interest stories are in there, and that's really what life is about. And you asked me this in the radio just yesterday when we were talking. You know, when you think about a Saddam Hussein or Adolf Hitler, it's easy to think about all the numbers and your eyes just gloss over and it doesn't mean anything. But when you hear the individual stories of the victims and the witnesses and the people like the interpreter that I worked with who gave his life and ended up dying during the trial, then you become emotionally moved by this and you understand how important this is in a way that the numbers never can convince you.
I just wanted to add one footnote to what you said about the origination of Nuremberg. The architect, the real architect of Nuremberg was Robert Jackson, because I was there. And he somehow melded the different nationalities into a single position on the trial, even though they came from different legal systems. He was very strong personality, and if you want to ever read something that's fascinating and good reading, you have to read the opening statement for the United States of America at Nuremberg. But Jackson is one of my heroes, and he always will be. And there would have been no Nuremberg without Robert Jackson. So.
Well, I want to ask you something about the comparison between Nuremberg and the Iraqi High Tribunal, Professor King. Nuremberg was set up as an international court to try war crimes, and Michael just pointed out that the Iraqis very much, and the U.S. had agreed to this, the Iraqis very much wanted to try Saddam Hussein in an Iraqi court. As somebody who had worked in Nuremberg, how did you see that? Did you, before it happened, and how do you see it now?
It's very hard to get a group of nations to agree on war crimes prosecution. The continental system is quite different from the United States, from the U.S. system and the English system. And Jackson had a number of battles with the Russians and the French. And it was Harry Truman, the president, who was also a hero of mine, who backed Jackson up. And he prevailed because of the backing of Harry Truman. And so it's hard to mobilize 3 or 4 countries things into a single prosecution. I understand the difficulty in doing it, but that's what made Nuremberg so important, was with 4 nations involved, you build a tremendous constituency for the effects of the trial. And now the leading supporters of the Nuremberg principles are the Germans. They ratified the Criminal Court Treaty 374 to nothing. So you broaden your constituency for international law by having an international trial, because every nation has its heroes.
So did you think then that back in 2004, did you personally think that an Iraqi High Tribunal was a mistake and that Saddam Hussein ought to have gone to the Hague?
Well, I wanted an international tribunal like Michael did. That's what Nuremberg was all about.
Well, the problem was this. So the U.S. invades Iraq with the United Kingdom, and almost the entire rest of the world have labeled that an illegal invasion. And so they were not interested in cooperating in an international process. And then once they decided, well, the Iraqis can have their own trial, the first thing the Iraqis insisted on was having the death penalty. Because, as they explained it to me, if Saddam was convicted, they didn't want him coming back and getting a pardon and re-emerging and taking over again and then retaliating by killing all the people that had just tried him. Much like after Charles I was killed 400 years ago in England, how all the people that were involved in that were later beheaded as well. And they were worried about that. But once they decided on the death penalty, the UK couldn't help out, the United Nations couldn't help out, and the lesson really is that the United States should have said to the Iraqis, look, if you want any international credibility here, you're going to have to give up on this one thing, the death penalty. If you insist on the death penalty, you're going to be completely isolated. It'll just be us and you against the rest of the world. I think that is one of the lessons there. But, you know, Nuremberg, the success was that you had an international court with 4 major countries, but many other countries that also signed on to the London Agreement.
Yeah.
And it really was a truly international effort.
It's a hard to manage because the Russians fought, the USSR fought the Americans on many issues. There was tremendous controversy in the creation of Nuremberg and the international negotiations that preceded the trial. But Jackson was a very strong-willed person. He had a will of steel, and he had immense mental powers.
And I want to point out, there was no analog to Robert Jackson here.
Right.
So the United States, you know, you basically had the military and Ambassador Bremer, and not a really stellar cast that were involved in this. Not people who will go down in history like Robert Jackson. And that makes a huge difference.
And Robert Jackson, when he got in a fight with the Russians, Truman was meeting with Stalin over in Potsdam. He slipped away one weekend, and he got Truman's backing for his position in conducting the trial. The Russians wanted a burden of, they wanted no presumption of innocence. They wanted presumption of guilt. And so he had the top support, and he was head and shoulders over everybody else at the time, and a candidate really for President of the United States, which he never got because he was over Nuremberg.
You know, when Henry just mentioned this presumption of guilt, it reminded me, one of the reasons the NGOs said that the Iraqi High Tribunal was not a legitimate tribunal is because they did not have a clause in their statute that said people were presumed innocent and had to be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Instead, what their statute says is that guilt had to be proven to the satisfaction of the judges. And so there was this guy, Richard Dicker from Human Rights Watch, who went around talking to all the newspapers, and in here we've got a footnote, so you're reading the footnotes, 24 different newspapers cited him as saying that this is an illegitimate tribunal because it doesn't have beyond reasonable doubt standard. Well, I talked to the Iraqis about that, and they said, well, we've never had those words, beyond reasonable doubt. That doesn't mean anything to us. What does it mean in the United States? And I said, well, that's a funny question because our own Supreme Court has refused to define those terms. And we feel like it's some kind of a talismanic phrase, but we don't know what it means either. And
every time I've heard lawyers talk about reasonable doubt, they say, well, it's a doubt that is reasonable.
Right. Is it 90%, 95%? I mean, no one knows. So when I was working with the Cambodian judges on their rules of procedure, they said, well, we don't want the international community condemning us like they did the Iraqi Tribunal, but we have the same problem because we're a civil law country and we use this term of art that the Iraqis use, and most of the countries in the world actually use it, proof to the satisfaction of the judges. So what they ended up deciding to do was very novel. In the French version of their statute and in the Khmer version of their statute, it says to the satisfaction of the judges. And in the English version, it says beyond reasonable doubt.
Because pretty much it actually does refer to the same thing.
They're the same standard, basically.
Well, I want to go back to the Iraqis for a second here, because it was sort of an autonomous decision, or an assertion of their own autonomy, to say, we want to try him in our courts, and we're capable of doing that, despite the fact that all the greatest international legal minds around doubted them.
Right.
You included.
Right.
And they gained an awful lot from that. They may have sacrificed something in the court of international opinion and public opinion, but they gained an awful lot of credibility for themselves and for their nation.
And interestingly, this is the one institution that they are most proud of and that is working most effectively in Iraq. You asked me just before we came out here what's happened since the Saddam trial. The Saddam trial was the first of 5 trials. 2 are ongoing. 2 other ones besides the Saddam trial were completed after Saddam was executed and he was no longer around, and the TV cameras stopped covering the trials and the radio shows stopped going to Baghdad and carrying what was going on there. Things started operating very efficiently. And the government, which I think the worst thing about these trials has been that the president and the prime minister have actually tried to reach in and interfere with the judges, and they've actually yanked some judges out because they were afraid that they were too pro-defense. They stopped doing that after the first trial because as you got to lower level defendants like Chemical Ali, they just figured let justice take its course. And so, in fact, the Iraqis were right. You know, they knew themselves best. And that's one of the things that Mike Newton was trying to teach me early on. He said that he was a student of Lawrence of Arabia. And during World War I, Lawrence of Arabia, who was trying to equip all of the Arab armies, said, look, it is better that they do it for themselves tolerably with our assistance than we try to do it for them perfectly. It's their war, and they have to fight it. And the Iraqis realized this was their battle of bringing justice back to their country, and they had to fight it their own way. And that's something that I think Americans never really fully understood.
It's a really different model of war, justice and war crimes and trying war crimes. I mean, you have Nuremberg and then you have Baghdad, and these are effective, both of them, in very different ways, but somewhat at odds.
In Nuremberg, there was no political interference, at least on the U.S. and the English side. And they were the ones who dominated the judgment of Nuremberg. It didn't seem to me that the Soviets related too well to what was going on. And the French were a bit lazy. That doesn't mean all Frenchmen were lazy.
No, of course not.
But they didn't do much. So as an American British, there's no political interference in what Jackson did at all.
And one of my biggest regrets about this process is that when we drafted the statute for the Iraqis with them, there was a clause that said that if a judge behaved improperly, they could be removed for cause, and the process was that the other judges would have to decide that issue. But then the statute went to the Iraqi National legislature, and that was an important moment because this was their democratic, elected, brand new legislature. Its very first thing was to adopt the statute. And they didn't just rubber stamp it, they started changing things around.
As the legislature is wanted to do.
And one of the things they did is they changed that clause. It's Article 5, and it now reads that the Prime Minister and President of Iraq can remove a judge from the Iraqi High Tribunal at any time for any reason. And that's where the wheels fell off of this process. And I do think if they had stayed with the first provision, or as we also tried to insist, if they had brought in a couple of international judges to sit with the Iraqi judges, that would have kept the process a little more honest. And at least from the outside, there would have been more of a veneer of legitimacy because outside of Iraq, this court has fared very bad in the court of public opinion.
Well, let's talk about the trial a little bit, if we could. And I have a first question that, why was it set up in this way that instead of trying a single individual, Saddam Hussein, for crimes against humanity or crimes against his people or all the gazillion things that he did that they could have lined up in documentary fashion, why did they try him, like that picture we just saw up there in this dock with 8 other defendants, on what was, as you say in the book, a relatively minor offense,
right.
the assassination, the execution of 148 civilians, compared to what he had done to the Kurds in the Anfal campaign. I mean, why didn't they just do a separate trial just for Saddam Hussein?
Right.
Here's
the answer. 2
Please.
words. Slobodan Milosevic. This is why I say that. Milosevic had been tried at The Hague in a giant mega trial. He was the only defendant, and he was tried for war crimes against Croatia and against Bosnia and against Kosovo over a 4-year period of time. And his trial was 5 years and counting, and he died of a heart attack. And by dying, he erased history from being written because they don't have trials in absentia, so there was never a judgment. They said with Saddam Hussein, who was 67 years old when the trial began, and his health wasn't all that great, they said, look, we cannot have a trial that lasts 5 or 6 years. He's not going to survive it. The country is not going to survive it. So the lesson of Milosevic was, let's have a smaller trial, and let's try him with other people, because if he dies and he's by himself, the trial ends. But if he dies and he's got co-defendants, the trial continues and you have a judgment.
That's very clever.
Yeah, so that's why he was
Who came
tried.
up with that?
Not exactly sure. I wish I could take credit for that, but this emerged through the process. Yeah. But the case of Dujal, though, although it was a small case, and the reason it was the one that was decided is they were just done with the evidence first. But it was chosen because it was a really, really solid case. It was a lot like Nuremberg because it was a documentary case.
Right.
For those of you who don't remember a couple of years ago this trial unfolding on CNN, basically what happened was this. One day in 1982, Saddam Hussein decides to go for a joyride to a beautiful little town about an hour north of Baghdad. It's a town that is probably the prettiest of all the towns and villages in Iraq because it's got its own little river, it's got date palms, it's got vineyards, and it's a mix of Shiites and
Driving out to
Sunnis.
Chagrin Falls.
It's the Chagrin Falls of Baghdad. So he goes out there, but he doesn't go out there to get a suntan and enjoy the water and everything. He goes out there because he heard that the Dawa party was very strong in this town. And he was in the middle of the Iran-Iraq war, and the Dawa party were the Iraqis who were peaceniks, who wanted the war to end, and they were sympathetic to Iran. And so he was really angry at this town, and he had not yet established the precedent that he was the iron leader and you don't cross him. And he was looking for an excuse, I think. So he drives up there, he hears some gunshots, he dispatches his guards, they come back with some dead children.
Wait, he hears some gunshots or there's an assassination attempt?
It was never proven exactly what happened. Even his own documents suggested that they weren't sure,
These guys could have been hunting pheasants.
Well, I don't know if there were pheasants in the date palms. But, they could have been taking target practice or something. We don't know. They could have been kids just playing around. It was a well-armed society. But they came back with some dead children's bodies. They said, we didn't find the people. These kids were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Saddam is furious. So he says, all right, we're going to make an example of this town. He rounds up everybody who's a member of the Dawa party. And he has them all sent to Abu Ghraib prison. So before we made it notorious, it was already notorious in a very different way. He has a trial concocted that lasted at most 5 minutes. Everybody apparently confessed that they were guilty. They were all found guilty, including some 10, 12, and 14-year-old defendants. And they were all executed en masse. And that wasn't enough because then he sends his vice president in, and the vice president basically takes, and you see the picture up there, it's been flashing, but there's a before and after satellite photo that NSA took, and this is the first time we've ever been able to publish this picture. We got permission from the government for it to be in our book. But you see this lush little town in the before photo, and it's just a parking lot, 5 miles wide with nothing left afterwards. And he said also in some tapes, yeah, that's it. in some tapes that were played during the trial, he said of the Marsh Arabs, listen, we were successful in doing this to Dajjal, let's do it down to the Marsh Arabs. So in a way, his MO, how he dealt with repression and with anybody who was against him, was established in this trial, in this town. And then one other thing about this, and that is that, and this reminds me so much of the work you did, Henry, but one of the most famous of the post-Nuremberg trials was the justice case, Alstamer.
Yeah.
And this is the case that was made into the movie Judgment at Nuremberg, which you've probably all seen with Spencer Tracy and
I
so
worked
forth.
on that.
Yeah, you sure did. And what happened is, in that case, they prosecuted the Nazi judges for presiding over courts that were political weapons. Well, no one who was a judge had been prosecuted for that crime until this trial. And so the biggest defendant, who sat next to Saddam in the front row, and that wasn't a coincidence, was Judge al-Bandar. And he was the head of the Revolutionary Court. And what he did, not just in this case, but in many cases after this, was he would just bring the political enemies into court, sentence them to death, and have the veneer of justice, which is exactly what the people in Nazi Germany
And this was, at that time in Iraq, there were two sort of parallel courts. There was a criminal court, and then there was the Revolutionary Court. And the Revolutionary Court was essentially Saddam's private court.
Plaything, yes. And one of the things that was so surprising to me is that the judges I was working with, they weren't a beaten people. You know, these weren't people that were emerging from 30 years of repression and they didn't have any spirit left. These were really an aggressive, spirited, spunky group of people. And it turned out that they were the judges of the regular court system. And Saddam tried a couple of times to meddle with them and had no success at all. And so what he did, much like Hitler did, was he created a parallel court system because he couldn't influence the regular courts. And so these judges actually were legitimate judges with a history of judging regular cases without political influence.
You said something?
I want to mention, you're talking about a defendant dying. I attended the Milosevic trial, but in the Nuremberg case, Gustav Krupp was a defendant who was named to represent industry, and he got a stroke. And Jackson went to the court and said, well, I'd like to substitute his son as a defendant. And the court said, well, this is not a baseball game or a football game. It's a trial. And so we went right ahead. But Krupp was ill, and it didn't stop the trial. That's the advantage of having a number of
And was he acquitted?
Who, Krupp?
Yeah.
No, he was convicted later in the subsequent proceedings.
But in the, oh, okay.
Yeah, he wasn't.
He wasn't tried because he was too ill to be a defendant.
Industrialist in the Nuremberg case.
You mentioned something before that you kind of glossed over, and I think it struck me as very, very interesting when I read it in the book and you talked about it, that NSA photographs were used as evidence in the trial. That in 1982, the NSA was taking satellite images of Dujal and other towns, presumably other towns in Iraq as well. And in 1983 and in 1984, they continued to do this. And so they had this historic record.
Right.
And they were collecting that for the express purpose at the time for a potential war crimes trial against Saddam Hussein at some later date that didn't happen for 25 years.
That's right. And what we don't remember is in 1982, even the term NSA was not in the public domain. We weren't allowed to know there was such an agency.
No such agency.
Right. And it's also so different than today because you can get on your iPhone and Google your house and see it from outer space and you can see it very quite clearly. But back then we weren't supposed to know that our government had the technology to spy so well. And it was, only in Clancy novels that you heard about these things. And it turned out to all be true. But yes, in fact, there was a satellite going over Iraq. They were very concerned about Iraq as far back as '82, the chemical weapons, the relationship with Iran. So they were snapping pictures, and it just turned out that they had snapped the pictures of this town before and after. But that wasn't it. After the Gulf War, the 1991 First Persian Gulf War, especially in the northern Kurdistan area that was liberated for the first time, protected by a no-fly zone, there were just hundreds of thousands of documents that were grabbed up. And after the 2003 invasion, again, there were all these documents that were grabbed up. And the secure document unit, which was in one of the old prisons, and actually just about 100 yards from where Saddam was executed, is this place that has been described as looking like the scene in Raiders of the Lost Ark at the end, when you just see the documents after documents, the boxes after boxes, cavernous, because there were that many documents. And they had a whole army of people that were just going through those, translating them into English, putting them on computers so they could be searchable. And as they found all these documents, it turned out they had everything they needed to literally hang Saddam Hussein with his own words.
Well, one of the things at Nuremberg was that Jackson decided it should be a documentary case. Let the Germans convict themselves, and he used their own documents to convict. Got in a fight with his deputy, who wanted the trial to attract newspaper attention, and Jackson sent him home. So,
and you know what, Henry? The exact same thing happened here. During the training sessions, the judges knew they had all these documents. They said, what if we only had a trial that lasted 2 days? And in fact, Ben Ferenz, your colleague, who presided as the prosecutor over the Eisengruppen case, he had a 2-day trial, and he didn't bring any people in. It was just documents. And they said, why don't we do this? And it was very much like the issue at Nuremberg. They decided, look, in order for the world to see this, for the Iraqis to see this, we have to bring witnesses in. And so the trial ends up lasting almost a year, but it was only really 39 trial days. But only 2 of those days were necessary, I think, for the conviction.
well, one of the things at Nuremberg was that Jackson felt that we're making new history here. And he wanted this Nuremberg principles to last into eternity. If you get a bunch of witnesses, you don't know enough about their background to have them have credibility that couldn't be attacked. And some of the witnesses, the few witnesses he did use, had some unfortunate records. I remember, I'm not going to go into it, but Jackson took the view that we're making new law. This creates a new humanitarian law, and we want to make it stick.
Well, and that's interesting because in the Saddam trial, there are moments when people are testifying, so-called witnesses who are also political enemies of Saddam and the other defendants, who were testifying behind a screen with their voices masked, and Saddam or his brother-in-law shout out, "We know who that is.
Yes, that's right.
Why are you disguising his voice?"
That's right.
But aren't witnesses necessary to provide the catharsis that the domestic and the international community demand from this court, which is sort of a form of theater as well?
Yeah, and when I mentioned earlier, just hearing numbers, your eyes gloss over. It's when you hear the individual stories. I mean, to bring that to light, think about World War II, what you know about the Holocaust, and I'm sure what springs to your mind in the audience is the Diary of Anne Frank, because that is the most compelling individual story that we've all read. Well, that's what witnesses do in a trial, and there were some witnesses that their stories would just bring tears to your eyes to hear them. And what Saddam, he realized this, and what he would do, because he was a very canny defense counsel / defendant, he would jump up whenever the testimony would get very compelling, and he would say something like, "I want to have a prayer break now," or "I was tortured and I want to talk to you about it," or he would say, "That person was only 14 years old when these things happen, and that's too young," or they would say, "That person is a woman, and we all know that women can't be trusted to tell the truth." He would say all these crazy things, but it would distract the media's attention. And I remember, because I was the CNN commentator on many of those days of the trial, that's all that they wanted to talk about on CNN. They weren't focusing on what the witnesses said, they were focusing on the crazy antics of Saddam Hussein, because it was wonderful theater, but unfortunately it wasn't the kind of theater that the people needed from a trial.
At Nuremberg, since it was documentary, the media lost interest after a while.
Yes. No, that's
when I came home, I did very well at Yale Law School, which is a good law school, and I had no job. And the public was not aware of what had gone on. But documents make dry reporting, and that's what they were talking about. The only colorful part of was the confrontation between Herman Goering and Robert Jackson, where many people felt that Jackson had met his match. But I think witnesses attract attention, and it gives them some, the reporters, we had 350 reporters there. It gives them something to report about, show they were there.
And what was unique about the Saddam trial is that rather than waiting till the end, like Herman Goering to take the stand, the Iraqi process allows the defendant to ask questions after their lawyer is done. And Saddam, who was also a lawyer, graduated high in his class from Baghdad Law School, felt that he was better than his than his retained lawyer, who happened to be former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. And so he would get up and ask all these questions, but he was able to do that on 39 different days. Every single trial day that Saddam was there, he got up and he gave speeches, and there was plenty to keep the media's attention.
And he argued with the judges.
Yes.
And it was actually the judge who was able to argue back who was more successful than the judge who had the more staid American
That
style.
was one of the weird lessons too. You know, I think we went into this as advisors with an arrogance and a very Western idea of what they needed. And one of the things we thought was there was this one judge who was really distinguished, and he was ultra mellow, and he was so likable, and you just couldn't, he was unflappable. You couldn't get him upset no matter what you did. We said, that's the judge they need to start with. And in fact, that's who they started the trial with. And so Saddam would get up and he would yell and scream at him, and he would call him names, and this judge just smiled at him and said, yes, 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 now let's continue. And we thought this was working great, and the Iraqi people were furious. And because one of the first changes in Iraq was there was a free press, and there were suddenly 600 different newspapers, every newspaper was castigating this poor judge. And he said, I've had enough, I don't have to be here. So he resigned, and he was replaced by Judge Rauf, whose name means kind in Arabic, but Saddam would tease him by saying, you're not Rauf, you know, which means you're not kind. And he wasn't. He was a bastard. As bad as Saddam was, he would give right back to him. And so on his very first day of the trial, Saddam tried to cause trouble. He said, sit down! And Saddam says, no, I'm not going to sit down. He goes, then you're out of here. Just like a baseball game. And, you know, they threw Saddam out. And the people of Iraq said, yes, that's what a judge needs to do. Show the dictator that the rule of law is as strong as the rule of might. Not someone who just smiles meekly, but someone who stands up to the dictator. And we're just like pulling our hair out saying, how can the court look fair when the judge is screaming and yelling at the defendant, throwing him out? But that is exactly what they felt they needed. And that's what they got. Let me tell you one other story related to this. One day during the trial, Saddam Hussein says, I heard that. There were bombs going on outside. And he says, and he looks right into the camera because every day of this trial is televised. And everybody in Iraq is watching this. They're like totally addicted to this.
So there's just a single camera? Or
there were cameras all over the place, but you could see the red light. He knows which one. He's very savvy. So, you know, the red light's there, the red light's there. He's looking. Anyway, he says, all right, I know that the people out there are fighting for me, and they're fighting to retake this country. I want you all to go out tonight and kill an American. Oh, and while you're at it, kill one of the Iraqi collaborators, the police, the government officials who are working with the American dogs. And the judge looks at him and he goes, Saddam, shame on you. It's one thing to say kill an American. I understand that. But to say kill the Iraqi. And afterwards, Mike Newton, who was in Baghdad. Oh, yes, I know. I'm channeling Alec Baldwin, by the way, who did a great impersonation of Saddam on Saturday Night Live. I only know what he sounds like in Arabic, and so this is, you know, taking liberties. But anyway, Mike Newton, who's in Baghdad, wants to find out from the judge, what were you thinking? I mean, this is crazy that you would say that about the Americans who are paying for the rehabilitation, you know, of Iraq and indirectly for your salary. And he says, well, I thought it out. You know, I didn't just say these things randomly. I thought two things. First of all, I wanted to show the world that we were not a puppet court. And I did that. And secondly, I wanted to show the Iraqi people that Saddam is not a hero. I wanted them to realize that the people who are killing your wives, your sisters, your daughters, it's always about women in Iraq, that those people who are dying in the marketplace are dying because of Saddam Hussein, that he's not a hero, he's the enemy of the state, which is part of how we got the title for the book. And so that moment is like many moments of the trial. We just didn't get it, and they did.
And that's a big lesson. What questions do you folks have? Go.
So you were over there in the wild, wild west. Did you have any fear for your safety?
Now, that's a good question. So there are two of us who write this book. There's the risk-adverse half, me, who basically works with the judges in London and Stratford-upon-Avon, you know, nice safe places where the judges could be anonymous. They're running around Shakespeare country with their chic robes and everything. But then there's Mike Newton, who has gone up through the military. He is a professor at West Point. Now he's a professor at Vanderbilt. And he would go shuttling back and forth to Baghdad. And he was right in the middle of it. And he would call me up and he would say, hold on a second. And I'd hear all this buzzing and noise and sirens in the background. I said, what's that? He goes, oh, nothing, some shrapnel just hit the building behind me. And it was totally unflappable about it. That's him, not me. But, you know, together I'll take some of the credit, but at least I partnered with him for it. He was courageous, yeah.
The makeup of the court, was it Sunni and Shia?
Yeah, but
What was the question?
the makeup of the court,
Sunni and Shia.
right. There was a provision in the statute that said if you were a high-level Ba'athist, you could not be on the bench. There were Sunnis, which is the party that the Ba'athists and Saddam were, but most of them were Sunni Kurds. And the others were Kurds and Shiites. There were some women. One of the interesting things is that the second trial of the Anfal case, after it was done, the judges decided to come to the United States. And their first stop was to Cleveland, to Case Western Reserve. One of the judges was a woman judge, and she had never had her face shown before for her protection. And for the first time ever, she's in front of everybody. And it was amazing the stories she told. I mean, she left her family up in the northern Kirsten area. She had a little kid that she left behind. She knew that she was really putting the rest of her life at risk. And she said, I'm doing this for my country. There were a lot of heroes in this story, and the judges certainly were some of them.
So,
How you know, sir? My name is Mohammed Dawoodi, and I was born in Baghdad, Iraq. In 1972, I spent 6-7 months of my life in a Moulthrop prison, and I met Saddam Hussein there. My concern here is foreigners like yourself, okay, coming to Iraq and trying to assist. As we are not civilized, we don't have judges to try people like Saddam Hussein. That's one thing. The other thing is, when the state of Israel kidnapped Eichmann in 1961, right? They took him to Israel, and they tried him to Israel. So why is it was an option for Saddam to go to Hague for his trial? Okay? Now, here's the thing. A person like Saddam Hussein, who killed 2.5 million Iraqis, Jews, Muslim, Christian, whatever, okay? Why deserve any trial to begin with?
Let me answer the several very important questions that you've packed in there. The first one is this. The statute for the Iraqi High Tribunal took the Nuremberg principles and the definitions of genocide. Oh, and by the way, yesterday, December 9th, was the 60th anniversary of the Genocide Convention. So we're really having this event at a very important moment in history. But the definitions of genocide came from the Genocide Convention. The war crime definitions came from the 1949 Geneva Conventions. The definition of crimes against humanity came from the Nuremberg Code. And the due process rights, which were used, were from the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is an international treaty that Iraq and the United States and most of the countries of the world have complied with, and it has literally a Bill of Rights built into it. What the judges told us was, first of all, they didn't know anything about war crimes because these are ordinary judges and they needed to be taught about this kind of area of the law. But they really didn't know about due process because the international standards had evolved over the 30 years that they were sort of under the repressive yoke of Saddam, and they weren't keeping track of these legal developments. And they wanted to make sure that their jurisprudence was compliant with those and that they would cite those. For the first time ever, we took all the Nuremberg and Yugoslavia and Rwanda Tribunal and human rights cases and had them translated into Arabic. They never in history were available to an Arabic-speaking community before 2 years ago. And that may be one of the most important things we did as assistants for this, because that body of law now is available in the law libraries of the law schools throughout the Middle East, not just in Iraq, and it wasn't before this trial. So yes, they needed some assistance. It wasn't necessarily that we were presuming that they weren't good judges, that they didn't know how to prosecute murder, but these cases were international crimes with international definitions, and they didn't know about them, and so they needed help with that. The other question, though, is, why even have a trial? And I think that gets back to what we were saying at the beginning. It's an age-old question. I mean, what Churchill said is, look, Hitler's guilt is so black. What good would a trial be? And what Stalin actually said is, look, in my country, the Soviet Union, we have these fake trials, these show trials. We know they're guilty beforehand, but everybody likes the show. And it was Truman who said, no, we have to have a real trial, and it has to be respected. It has to respect the rule of law, and it's good for the world if we can do this. What's the famous thing Jackson said about the hand of might being stayed?
Jackson said that in a speech the day after Roosevelt died, April 13, 1945, he said that we should have a trial, but he wanted no part of a trial that was a railroad to conviction. That was his point. And he said the trial in his opening statement that this trial is the greatest tribute power has ever paid to reason. So Jackson was very aware that you need to have a record of these regimes.
And I think for Iraq, being a new government, a new democracy, wanting to establish the rule of law, they wanted to start off with the right step, which was having a trial and not just an execution.
The history of Nazi Germany was written at Nuremberg, and if you read the transcript, which I have read, you'll find you've got a total history of the takeover of power, and then until the very end, when they lost Stalingrad and the bunker in Berlin, where Hitler committed suicide.
Let's take a question from the back.
You have told us about the importance of the insistence on the death penalty, but you haven't commented here so much about the actual execution and how it was handled. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit of your thoughts on that.
All right. The execution was a fiasco. In the 2-minute tape that was smuggled out, everything that the defense wanted to do in its year-long trial was accomplished, which is to totally discredit the whole process, to make people disgusted. It was worse than that, because in the tape, Saddam looks very heroic. He stands up very quietly, and as they're about to kill him, the guards jump around, dancing with glee, shouting, Maqtada, Maqtada, which is the name of his enemy, Maqtada Sadr. And the world was just disgusted. I mean, this is not what we expect a solemn undertaking, an execution to be like. Now, I'll say a couple of things about that. One is, the tape that was smuggled out only showed the second half of what happened. And the actual official video, which we use here in the transcript in the book, shows a little bit different picture, and this is what happened. Saddam is brought into the room, and he's asked, do you want a hood or not? He says, I don't want a hood. And immediately he launches into insulting all the people in the room, which are mostly just prison guards. And there's one guy who's from the Tribunal, who's the deputy prosecutor, Munketh. And the prison guards are sitting there, and he says, he says, you're a bastard, and you're going to hell, and I'm going to have a fatwa on you, and you're going to be killed when you walk out of here, and all this other stuff. And they get all upset with him, and so they start yelling back. And that's when the cell phone video started. Also, in the back of the cell phone video, there is this voice shouting out, hey, everybody, behave yourselves. This is supposed to be a solemn undertaking. We're supposed to be respectful. This is an execution, not a circus. That's Munketh. That's the guy from the Tribunal, and he's trying to do his job. And that doesn't change anything. I mean, it was a terrible moment. They really botched it. But here's one thing that surprised me. I thought that a year later, on the anniversary of his death, and the anniversary's coming up again in 10 days, it's the 30th of December, that there would be a huge sort of protest or a lot of violence, or a lot of people would go to his funeral cemetery plot in Tikrit and pay homage to him. And you know what? None of that happened. The Iraqi people just said, Saddam's gone, let's move on. And when we talk about why things in Iraq have improved a lot lately, and we're now in a position where the Americans can pull out, it's not just the surge. It's also the fact that Saddam isn't there anymore. And even though I strongly am against the death penalty in the United States, when I talked to the Iraqis, they knew that this would happen. And I said, no, it's not going to be like that. And once again, they knew their country better than I did. And that is a frequent, I think, lesson about, internationals trying to help other countries. It's the presumption of arrogance that you refer to that we have to avoid at all costs. And it's a real risk that I take every time I go into a place to help out.
This young man has a question.
How many judges did you train going over there?
So I went to London.
The question was how many judges were there?
So I went to London for the secret training session, and there were 42 judges there. And of the 42, one judge, Judge Rod, spoke English. My interpreter, a man by the name of Rayad, spoke English, and all the rest only spoke Arabic. So I would pal around with this roly-poly British-sounding interpreter who I became very close with. And I would talk with all the judges, both in groups and one-on-one. And one of the funny things is Islamic people aren't supposed to drink, but they have this sort of extraterritorial view of that. So they were in London, and they would go to the pubs, and we'd hang out and so forth and get to know each other.
When in Rome?
Yeah, but we ended up dedicating the book to Rayad because he was one of the heroic people who didn't make it through the trial. He was assassinated, and one of the sad stories.
I had one comment on the death penalty. One of the things, I talked with Herman Goering on September 28, 1946. One of the problems you have is if you don't kill them, you think you're always afraid that they'll rise again. And Herman Goering told me that in 60 years the Nazis would be back. You fought a world war where 55 million people were killed, and most citizens paid with their lives in many countries. And so we didn't want the Nazis to rise again. And so I think that has something to be said for the death penalty in that case, because you want to kill this movement forever. And if Herman Goering had been allowed to live, then he'd be arguing for it, and he's a national hero.
The Iraqi judges would talk about the Napoleonic precedent. Remember Napoleon, when he was defeated, was sent first to the island of Elba, and then he comes back and he takes over again, and then he has to be defeated a second time and sent to St. Helena. Well, Saddam had also been put in prison at the beginning of his career for trying a coup d'etat. He was pardoned, and then he took over in another coup d'etat. And I think the Iraqis were really worried that if he was ever still alive, they couldn't move on.
Well, and you reminded me the other day that Charles Taylor was in exile, trying to come back.
That's right.
And these things do happen. Sir?
Did the trial contribute to the development of the rule of law in Iraq?
I understand the question.
Was it a success?
That's the second question I'd like to ask. I'll ask it right now. Could an Israeli today get a fair trial in Iraq?
Oh, someone once asked me when I was trying to talk about the benefits of this tribunal, they said, oh, come on, Professor, where would you rather be tried, an American court or this Iraqi court, which is sort of the question you're asking. And I said, you know what, depending on the color of my skin or my nationality or my ethnicity, what part of the United States I was being prosecuted in, I'm not sure that question is so clear-cut. So that's a tough nut to crack. I don't know. I don't think an Israeli would necessarily want to be tried in an Iraqi court. And I don't know how fair the Israelis would think that trial would be. But for Iraqis being tried in the Iraqi courts, their court system is moving along. They have this new court besides the Iraqi High Tribunal called the Criminal Court of Iraq. And they've been doing a lot of prosecutions, and it seems to be functioning like a real court without a lot of influence from the government. And the thing about the Iraqi High Tribunal, this court that tried Saddam, is that unlike a United States court where we have a jury verdict that comes out of a black box and we don't really know what the jury was considering and whether it was fair or not, they had to write all their findings of fact and conclusions of law in a written opinion. It was 300 single-space pages long. And you read it and you go, okay, now I understand what the thinking was. I see what the evidence was, and this does seem like justice. And I think this is a huge development for Iraq.
The criminal court of Iraq, is that court prosecuting insurgents and terrorists who are caught?
Yeah, and it's prosecuting pretty much everybody. And one of the also changes is that the United States had custody over a lot of Iraqis, including all the ones that were being tried by the Iraqi High Tribunal. As of last month, the U.S. no longer has anybody in our own custody in Iraq. We've turned that completely over to the Iraqis.
That's very good news indeed. Sir?
Yes, this gentleman pointed out that Saddam Hussein killed 2.5 million people or so. What was the world outrage about this? I mean, it seems everything homes down to, I'm not sure how many people were killed that he actually was convicted upon. I mean, it seems a minuscule amount of people, and yet on the world stage, you've got 2.5 million people.
Yeah.
Do you think the outrage would have been?
You know, there was a lot of ambivalence about Saddam in his early years because the world was more afraid, like it is today, of Iran than Iraq. And he was fighting Iraq. And it was sort of this theory that the enemy of my enemy must be sort of my friend. The United States worked with Saddam Hussein. And to some extent, the chemical weapons that he used came from Western hands. The precursors came from the United States. There are images, we don't have the picture in the book, but you can get it on Google, where you see then, I guess he was chief of staff, Rumsfeld, giving a handshake and a giant suitcase full of money to Saddam because he was our dictator fighting against the evil Iranians. That's part of the problem. So what he was doing was sort of shrouded in that ambivalence and ambiguity. But you know, at some point, the numbers started to add up, and you know, by the time he was killing the northern Kurds and the southern Shiites in '91, this was a huge, terrible moment for the United States. If you remember back, it's not that long ago. We had just won this Persian Gulf War. We got Iraq out of Kuwait. And instead of going into Baghdad and taking over, we decided to pull back. If you saw the movie W recently, you see the history of that. But what happens immediately after that, that's not in the movie, is that the Shiites and the Kurds decide to rise up and try to overthrow the dictator. And they do that with the urging of the United States. And you know, we thought, yeah, sure, throw them out, that might be convenient. But we didn't give them any help at all. And he came at them so quick, they didn't know what hit him. So within moments, he's gassing and killing 180,000 northern Kurds, and he's out there killing 500,000 southern Shiites and burning all their marshes and turning that into a parking lot, much like Dajjal. And you know what? It was a really bad moment for the United States because we just stood back and did nothing. And we had set that in motion.
Started the no-fly zone.
Yeah, okay, we did that. That's true. No, that's true. We did a no-fly zone, yeah.
There's a question in the back there.
I'm interested to know when Iraq kept the trial, it's a domestic trial, if you will, but they took all of these definitions. Was it considered a trial of violating international law, or did Iraq adopt international law and make it Iraqi law?
Yeah. That was actually one of the legal issues that the defense argued. They said, these crimes in international law were never part of our domestic law, and therefore it's ex post facto. You can't apply them here. In the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is this international human rights document, Article 15 says that an exception to the ex post facto rule are any international crimes under customary international law. And it was written in there to adopt the Nuremberg principle, because remember, in Nuremberg, the Nazis were basically saying, look, it wasn't illegal in our country to do these things. In fact, it was the policy of our country, and it was perfectly legal. And the Nuremberg court said, because of Henry and his colleagues, look, if it's against international law, you can't use that defense. And that was written into this human rights treaty, and the Iraqi High Tribunal quoted Nuremberg in their decision. And they said, these are international crimes under customary international law, therefore they are appropriate for us to prosecute. Interestingly, when I was in Cambodia, as you mentioned, Henry, the same issue is coming up with the defense. They're saying, look, we didn't have these crimes in 1975 to 1979 when the genocide was occurring, so therefore you can't prosecute them. And the answer is, well, these were crimes under customary international law. And in fact, you could cite to the Iraqi High Tribunal decisions as well as the Nuremberg Charter for that principle.
His question points to one of the chief defense arguments that you sort of mentioned there, but that essentially the entire court was illegitimate.
Yeah.
Because and there's always that question, isn't there, between when in these sorts of cases, and Henry, you can speak to this too, that you establish a court and you say this court is legitimate, but you're trying these power structures, these authorities who have their own authority and their own power outside of that court, and as Saddam said, I don't recognize this court. I am the president of Iraq. Who are you?
Well, one of the points at Nuremberg was that on ex post facto, the court said it's a principle of justice, not a limitation on sovereignty. Now, Albert Speer, whom I wrote a book about, told me that it would have been an injustice not to have prosecuted the defendants at Nuremberg, and he was one of them. He said that you have to get to the spirit of what these limitations are all about. Again, a principle of justice, not a limitation on sovereignty.
There was this related argument to legitimacy, which has a Latin phrase, tu quoque, which means you also, that both the Nuremberg defendants used and Saddam and his colleagues used, which is basically this. At Nuremberg, they said, how can you prosecute us for crimes against humanity when you've just firebombed Dresden? When you've just dropped atomic bombs for the first and only time in history on civilian populations in Japan? You know, there's something to that, right? Saddam Hussein said, how can you say that responding to terrorists by burning down trees and rounding people up and putting them in Abu Ghraib is so bad, when that's in fact exactly what the United States is doing in Iraq and in Afghanistan and around the world in its war on terror? And you know what? They had a point there. And
using the same prison.
Yeah, well, and 30 pages of the final decision of the Iraqi Tribunal is dedicated to the question of where do you draw the line when you're fighting terrorists? What can a country do and what can't a country do? And I think,
where did they draw the line?
well, they had maybe an easy case, as Nuremberg was as well. They said, look, you can't just destroy an entire town. You can't put 14-year-olds and 10-year-olds in prison and execute them. So it was a pretty easy case. But they also said, you know, the principles are you have to discriminate between civilians and combatants. And you can't disproportionately harm the civilian population. And you can't have a trial without due process. One of the great ironies is right after this trial, Judge Ralph goes up for a vacation in London. And the defense counsel quickly tried to get a criminal prosecution against him in England under universal jurisdiction for presiding over an unfair trial of these Iraqis, the very thing that he convicted the Judge Al-Bandar for. And fortunately, I think for Judge Ralph, the United Kingdom found that there was no case to be made, and he came back to Iraq, and he's now presiding over one of the 5 trials. But I thought that was fascinating, that the very thing he had convicted these people of, he was then facing the charge. And maybe one of the lessons of this whole trial to anybody in the Middle East, and maybe here in the United States as well, is that if you don't give due process, if you use your court as a political weapon, you yourself become the criminal. And that's a lesson that we're struggling with too, you know, in the United States.
We had 3 defendants that were acquitted at Nuremberg, but on the bombing of Dresden, the official position of the United States was that international law does not cover air warfare. So
it would today, though.
Yeah, I wanted to do 2 things. One, I wanted to bring a case against Willie Messerschmitt, who was the designer of Messerschmitt aircraft, and also the bombing of Rotterdam, because they put up the white flag, and then the Nazis bombed the hell out of it. But I was told to lay off that because we'd get Dresden as a counterattack.
We're going to have one final question. Ma'am.
Well, comment and then a question.
says the victors write the history, the victors hold the trial. That is to say, if you end up being the winner, then you're the ones who get to try the others and claim that those are the crimes. Whereas you may have done the same thing yourself, but you're not holding the trial. But I also wanted to ask Professor Scharf too, also, you've mentioned that there were problems with this trial, and you specifically identified the political interference and the removal of the judges. Could you identify anything else that you think really made it problematic to hold this trial?
Yeah, okay, so let me address both of those and then we'll end on that note. The first one is really a tough question. Now there's this International Criminal Court in The Hague, and 107 countries have already signed up to it. And the judges are there, so they're not victors' judges. So whenever a situation occurs in the future, they're already there. And that makes things a little bit better. But the truth is, for countries like the United States and China and Russia that are very powerful, that have a veto in the Security Council, that don't want to ratify the ICC statute, they will never find themselves facing international justice. And so the practicalities of the world is that international justice is going to be for countries where the leaders have fallen, or small little countries, African countries, Latin American countries, maybe some Asian countries, but not for the big boys and girls of the world stage. And that is a sad point because we're not really there. Now, the question about what else went wrong in the trial, we could have subtitled this book, the trial where everything went wrong, and it was just sort of one disaster after another, and so many things that we just couldn't anticipate. And we thought we'd learned all the lessons from the Milosevic case, and now they think they've learned all the lessons from the Saddam trial. But it's sort of like the defense counsel and the defendants are mad scientists, and they're experimenting with all these new tactics to disrupt and derail the proceedings. And the judges are sort of these doctors, and scientists in a race to find a cure. And every time they find something, then there's another new thing, and it just keeps escalating, and it never ends. The part of the lesson, though, is this: a dictator or a leader who finds themselves in one of these trials is not going to play by the rules. And their defense counsel, like Ramsey Clark, are not going to try to get an acquittal. What they're going to do is to try to disrupt and hijack the trial. And some people like Jacques Varges, who is the defense counsel in the Cambodia Tribunal, says, that is my duty, my responsibility. If I believe that the court is unfair, then that's what I should do. And what he's done, in fact, is there's a documentary about him called The Terrorist Advocate, in which they showed that in Algeria, he took these terrorists and he disrupted the trial so much that even though they were convicted, ultimately there was a change in government and they were all released and he won. And he said, that's what I'm going to do in the Cambodia Tribunal. And the question, though, is this: when you're talking about genocide, when you have 2 million victims and they really need the trial to be orderly and fair so that they can have this cathartic effect that Dan mentioned, is it really fair for the defense counsel to play this game, knowing that it's not going to help their client? And I think that the judges have to be tough about it. And I think when the defense counsel do it, they ought to be thrown out and replaced with other defense counsel. And in fact, what's happening in Rwanda just this week, a defense counsel started acting this way, and for the first time ever, an international tribunal has filed a complaint with the New York Bar Association against the defense counsel, who's an American, saying this person ought to be disbarred because of what they're doing in a foreign court. They would be disbarred if they did it in another state for this kind of action. Why not?
And it's worth noting that it was the court-appointed defense counsel that happened in the Saddam trial. His lawyers were boycotting, and so court-appointed lawyers finished it up.
Right. And let me say one last point about that. I guess we'll end on this. I gave that kind of speech when I was in Cambodia, and the defense counsel thought that was just terrible that I was saying this, because they were there in the room too. And they said, so your book, Enemy of the State, this title refers to defense counsel, right? Sarcastically. And I said, you know what? It does. And I told the following story, and I'll end with this story. At the end of the trial, as Dan just mentioned, Saddam's defense counsel that he had hired were boycotting to show that the trial was illegitimate. And they put public defenders in. And the public defenders were these Iraqis that we helped train, and they were being assisted by a Canadian named Bill Wiley, who helped them write the closing arguments and so forth. And the lead public defender was this tiny little diminutive guy. He was very shaky. And he stands up and he says, I will now give the closing argument for Saddam Hussein. And Saddam, unlike almost any dictator who's ever been on trial, was not at all a defeated person. He was as charismatic and powerful in the court as he had been as a leader. So he stands up and he says, "You will not give the closing argument. I order you not to. My real lawyers are boycotting to show the illegitimacy of this tribunal, and you will do so as well. And if you speak another word, I will consider you the enemy of the state," which is, in fact, where we got the title. The title comes from various things. Well, this little guy is shaking. He's got the water in his hand, and it's spilling all over the place. And literally, I think he may have soiled his pants. And then he gives a 4.5-hour closing argument for Saddam Hussein. And it was so good that one of the defendants is acquitted outright, walks out a free person. 3 get light sentences, 2 get life sentences, and 3, including Saddam, unfortunately for him, get the death penalty. And then the United Kingdom nominates this little diminutive guy whose name no one knows, but they just said the little guy, for their prestigious Rule of Law Award, which is the most prestigious award that the bar gives in the UK. And he was, too, a real hero. So yes, it was the defense counsel who were the enemy of the state, but only in Saddam's eyes.
Well, it's a story of heroes, and they're in the grand history of all of these trials. There are 2 of them sitting on the stage. Thanks very much, you guys. This has been a real pleasure.
Thank you all for coming. If you want to read more of these inside stories, the book is full of them, and I'll be signing copies outside. It makes a great holiday present.
Yeah. I didn't get a chance to welcome you when you came in this evening, but I'm Linda Bender. I'm the Director of Education Public Programs here at the Maltz Museum, and I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening for a fascinating, fascinating discussion. Michael is going to be signing books, so I know what happens in this room is everybody rushes the speaker and doesn't let him out the door, but I'm going to suggest that you let him out the door so that we can set up for the book signing. You will get a chance to talk to him one-on-one. So thank you. Before you leave, I wanted to tell all of you one thing, because I know many of you may not have been to the Maltz Museum before, and this topic is of great interest to you. The next exhibition we will be opening after our Superheroes exhibition, which is here now, will close in January. We'll be opening an exhibition called The Enemy Within, Terror in America, 1776 to the present, that is coming to us from the Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. And it addresses many of the issues that have been talked about here tonight. That show will open in the beginning of April and run through a portion of the summer. So it's your way out. Please pick up one of our brochures about it. If you're not on our mailing list, certainly please do that so that you can get the announcements about that exhibition. We'll be dealing with many programs that will handle quite a lot of these issues about how governments deal with terrorism, and in this case, with that exhibition, terrorism on their own soil. So please come back for those. We look forward to seeing you again here at the Maltz Museum. Thank you so much for being here.